I want to thank you for inviting me to this conference and thank you for attending. Now, because this stream is about type and brain science, I need to come clean. I know more about type than I do about neuroscience. So my talk stems from a concern that I have, and that concern is that people are adopting neuroscientific findings with too little critical evaluation. In fact, I observe how sometimes neuroscientific findings are being used as marketing ploys because they're very persuasive. Dropping in how the amygdala lights up or the frontal cortex is activated seems to build credibility and create an allure that sometimes evades or discourages scrutiny. So my aim, therefore, is to sow some doubt, to raise some issues that will counter what I often see as lazy thinking, and to really question the enormous leap from neurons firing to thoughts about the beginning of the universe, and that these need much more careful scrutiny. So I hope you'll join me in an exploration of some critical issues, and to do so with an open mind. And I'm well aware that cultivating an open mind is not easy. So the way I propose to do that is to divide this talk into three main themes as follows. The first is the tension that there is between complexity and simplicity. We have an increasingly complex world, and I observe, at least in recent times, an attraction to the increasingly simplistic and superficial. The second is the grip that epiphenomenalism has, the belief that we are just chemical and electrical events. To many, this is simply logic, but as a scientist, I question whether it is wise to sidestep that profound philosophical dilemma, the mind-body issue. And then thirdly, I want to look at the way in which we are applying neuroscience to psychological phenomena. And for this conference, I will focus particularly on personality. I will take each of these themes in turn and pause so that we can discuss what may be controversial about each of them, and especially the third theme, and then perhaps we can discuss where we go from here. So let me begin with a simple question. Is this top moving? Imagine that it is spinning. Is it moving? The answer can be both yes and no. It is not moving because there's no change in spatial location. However, it is moving if we separate movement into positional and rotational movement. This is complicated by this spinning top. Plato called this the principle of opposites, particularly apt for this Jungian audience, since the two answers are incompatible until we refine and dissect the concept of movement. And we need to recognize that there are layers of complexity, so consider whether this person is moving. Forget his breathing and muscle tone, etc. Again, the answer can be both yes and no. He's not moving because there's no change in spatial location. Also, he's not rotating. However, he is in fact moving at 667 miles per hour because he's based in London. However, if he was based in Texas, he would be moving at 900 miles per hour. Not because Texas is the go-getter state, but because it's closer to the equator. The Earth is spinning, and so all of us are moving relative to the Sun, even if we're not moving relative to the Earth. And why am I making these points? It is because we need to recognize how we have a tendency, even a necessity, to simplify the world. Every concept identifies and limits. We ask about movement, which sets up the opposite, no movement, and that the reality is much more complex. The fact is that we are born to simplify. And why? Well, if you imagine walking alongside this overgrown pond or river, you may be blissfully unaware that you may not survive the hungry predator. Or if you hear a rustle in the undergrowth, you may not survive that either. Or this snorkeler is interested in that rock. But far better to recoil, because who knows what this is? It could be poisonous. Survival did not favour those who took too much time to contemplate different possibilities. They probably failed to pass on their genes, and we are programmed to take a small amount of data and to react, to infer, to jump to conclusions, because it could mean life or death. It is our basic fight or flight mechanism, and we are biologically programmed to simplify. But how does this work as society becomes more complex? To live together and to survive, we need different things, different triggers, and a key one is the us and them dichotomy. Small tribes survive because they have contact, recognition, group identity. We can see how strong this binary concept is from the Stanford prison experiments, where Zimbardo divided the group into prisoners and warders, and very quickly the two group identities formed. And the consequence was that the experiment had to be stopped. So the us and them reaction is also fundamental, but it does limit the size of the group. What happens when our groups become too large, beyond say 10, 50 or 150, wherever the transition point is? But also look at how we manage to live in much larger societies. The transition from small tribes to today's larger societies requires something else, which I suggest is a moral code, and by which I mean a basic concept of right and wrong. Without these fundamental judgments, these three fundamental judgments, we could not survive and live together. But notice how each one of them is binary, which is fundamentally simplistic. Now look at how this binary decision making is playing out today. Consider someone who says, "I'm a Trump supporter." It is very likely that you have already made judgments about that person. Am I right? Similarly, in the UK, if someone says they voted Leave in the Brexit referendum, this makes most people make all kinds of assumptions about them, not all of which will be true. The binary thinking applies to many reactions that we have to issues such as abortion, gender, or even if someone says they support a particular baseball or football team. Now, one piece of information is like a label which carries a whole package of additional views and characteristics. And if you support those views, you're much more likely to judge the person as a good person. But if you don't, it is a small step for a wrong or bad view to be a bad person. The point I am making is that the essential decision-making equipment that enabled us to survive and to live in large groups is challenged more and more because our brains are now having to deal with much more than a rustle in the bushes. Let me illustrate. The information per second is increasing exponentially, a consequence of technology in the information age. And also the complexity of explanation is also increasing. Take the explanation of lightning, from Jupiter hurling thunderbolts to the structure of the atom, the movement of electrons, the creation of positive and negative charge, etc. I suggest that the former is much more accessible to the average brain than the latter. We are facing ever-increasing complexity together with less immediate, less tangible, more abstract explanations, which are less appropriately binary. So I'm suggesting that the rot has set in, but I don't want to be too negative about social media, because by rot, what I mean is the rate and range of transmission. Social interaction has always included the ability to react, to shout, to lash out when we feel angry or threatened, but social media allows our reactions and cries to be heard across the globe within seconds. Now compare this with face-to-face, which not only provides a more restricted range, but it benefits from more immediate and nuanced feedback. Face-to-face usually requires some element of restraint, adjustment and correction, especially with other people in the room. And of course, there's always been such a lot of binary thinking, but social media has amplified it and reduced the likelihood of it being corrected and challenged. And if you want a deeper analysis of the differences between what we can call mediated communication via technology and things, and unmediated, i.e. face-to-face, then feel free to read The Relational Lens, which discusses the differences in more depth. So I suggest we pause here for some comments and reflections and challenges before exploring how this tendency towards simplicity and binary thinking may be percolating into the way that science is being communicated and used. So this brings me on to the question of whether we are just our synapses, or is this simply another expression of our binary thinking? Are we in danger of such simplicity feeding through to the way in which we think about and explore with our new tools in neuroscience? Taken simply, if we are made up of atoms and molecules, then chemical and electrical events create life, and a series of physiological events leads through to us. This means that physiological events somehow convert into psychological phenomena, with the consequence that mapping these events will eventually explain and predict not only what we do, but who we are. We are our synapses. Is it possible that chemical and electrical reactions, when sufficiently understood, will help us to predict such esoteric philosophical debates as Thomas Aquinas's "how many angels can dance on the end of a pin?" or the concept of dark matter? This ultimate physiological reductionism sees the mind as a byproduct of physiological activity, just the hum of the engine or the machine, which serves no real purpose. And this views things as a one-way system from physiology, the engine, to psychology, thoughts and mind. But is this belief in danger of limiting our thinking, of restricting what we choose to investigate, and ultimately will it limit rather than enhance our understanding? Let me illustrate. One of the first experiments I was introduced to as an undergraduate was a group of subjects being injected with epinephrine. Now, this may not pass today's ethics committees, but we are talking pre-1970. And half the group were told this drug would make them feel anxious. The other half were told that it would make them feel excited. The result? After the experiment, those who had expected to feel excited reported feeling excited, and those expecting to feel anxious reported feeling anxious. This clearly suggests a feedback loop between the mind and the body, whereby thoughts, the brain, the mind, affects the interpretation of our physiology. And if that is so, then our mind is somewhat more than just the hum in the machine. Another example is the well-documented placebo effect. It appears that the mind controls or tricks the body. Somehow, thoughts and expectations can cure diseases, mitigate pain, transform experience, etc. This is certainly a challenge for the synapse brigade, the physiological reductionists, the materialists, those on the physical wing of the mind-body problem. We still need to explain the experience of pain and the nature of wonder and curiosity, the thoughts that create God or explain the Big Bang, and to say that these are simply a byproduct of a fertile mind strikes me as a feat of enormous intellectual laziness. Epiphenomenology is in danger of treating all our experiences and thoughts like a can that can be kicked down the road to some mystical future where electrical impulses recreate the experience of God or the wonder of contemplating the universe. Believing that multiple neurotransmissions will ultimately explain, they predict such experiences is, I suggest, just as big a leap of faith as the accusation directed at the other side, the non-material, the soul and the God camps. Now, I'm clearly not going to resolve the mind-body debate here, but it may actually defy resolution. What I want to suggest is that binary thinking on the mind-body problem is particularly unhelpful, and that we need multiple ways of exploring the products of such fertile minds. One way that might engage both sides of the debate could be to recognise and invoke the concept of discontinuity. And what I mean by this can be illustrated by one of the most common and yet one of the most strange substances on Earth, water. Consider water as a solid. Most substances contract and get denser as they cool. Water, unlike any other substance almost, expands as it freezes. In fact, it expands before it freezes from about 4 degrees Celsius. This makes it very unusual. And as water, consider its properties and effects, which then transform when it reaches a very high boiling point. I suggest that the conversion from synapses to angels is even more unusual, and that we use from water to steam as a metaphor for synapses to the Big Bang. This doesn't mean that we don't explore the extent and limitations of a synaptic approach, but our mindset actively pursues this principle of discontinuity. We need to consider the properties of mind in a more nuanced way. How does water become steam? How do electrical impulses become mind? And where does personal experience fit in? And I suggest that the transformational mechanism that occurs between water and steam, between synapses and experiences, is the importance of language. Most people believe that Inuits have at least 30 words for different types of snow. Not true, by the way, but they do have more than we do. The consequence is that they are far more observant of differences in snow conditions than the average Brit or American. It introduces a more complex perception and eventually a more complex understanding of the world. But now consider the word love. If I tell you I love you, what do you understand? In this context, it may mean one thing. In a darkened room, it may mean something quite different. Clearly, here, I don't mean romantic love. Perhaps I mean self-love. I love you because you make me feel great. Or maybe I mean this is part of my love of humanity, because I'm a humanist or a Buddhist or a Christian, etc. The problem is that love covers so many different things. Here are 8 of the Greek names that differentiate between different kinds of love. And this leads to another interesting paradox. The paradox of words. If we name something, we bring it into vision. But by naming something like love, we can be throwing a blanket over all the differences that it covers. It both clarifies and obfuscates, which brings me on to the use of labels and binary thinking. The Stanford experiment, Zimbardo's prisons and warders, demonstrated the ease with which the us and them dichotomy was so natural to fall into. The type community has been castigated by academic psychology for its approach to labelling. And I know this is often due to a misunderstanding of type theory, but we share some responsibility for feeding the flames. And unfortunately, the blanket of obfuscation is getting bigger or heavier, or whatever the right adjective is. In fact, we very often use even less defined words to obscure a whole host of differences. For example, I just need to know, where do you drink your coffee? If it's from Dunkin' Donuts, you are statistically more likely to vote Republican and be a Trump supporter. If you buy it from Starbucks, you're more likely to be a Democrat. And each of these labels carry an extraordinary number of associations, assumptions. In today's world, perhaps our ability to recognize differences is decreasing. Signals can replace words, and I believe that part of the reason for this is how we communicate. Now, I'm not blaming it all on social media, not all anyway, but let me come back to Twitter in a moment. This is a phenomena that we can recognize, which is evidence of our decreasing vocabulary. And as evidence, and there is a great deal available, let me use Michael Clay's analysis of the range of words used in classic literature versus more modern literature. You can see here his analysis of the difference between David Copperfield, published around 1850 with 1,356 classic words, compared to Catcher in the Rye, published around 1950, which has 14. Now, this analysis can be severely criticised, but when we look at plenty of other evidence, such as Jean Twenge's results using the National Survey data on a sample of 29,912, and she reports how people's understanding of a range of words has declined since the 1970s. Now, I would not use either of these studies on their own. How could I? I'm asking you to be critical of how data is presented. But when put alongside many others, I'm drawn towards the conclusion that the vocabulary of the population is decreasing, which brings me back to Twitter. As the world gets more complex, what is the impact of encouraging communication that is limited to 140 or now 280 characters? Of course, people can use very complex language in very short sentences, but I think the trend, the impact of our technological revolution, has been towards simplification, which means less differentiation and thus playing straight into the binary playbook. Now, I suspect that this is an overgeneralization, and that is probably not true of my audience here today. But it does bring me back onto the question and concern that I want to highlight regarding neuroscience. So against this backdrop of increasing complexity alongside a natural tendency towards simplicity, it's becoming too common to support opinions by making reference to the amygdala, the hypothalamus, MRI scans or endorphins. And I must say that I do get annoyed when every Tom, Dick and Harry sprinkles their opinions with such references. Of course, there is some very good neuroscience, but they are easily misquoted, and there are also many poor studies that create headlines which are grossly misinterpreted and overgeneralized. Let me give you examples. If you read the literature, you would believe it was pretty well established that the introvert brain and the extrovert brains fire differently. One claim is that introverts have more firing in the anterior frontal lobe areas, and that extroverts fire more in the posterior parts of the brain. Personally, I believe there is substance to there being differences, but are we getting ahead of ourselves? What does this mean? Whenever we hear something like this, we need to put it through multiple checks to see what we've got. Otherwise, we'd fall into the correlation trap. There are plenty of examples of misuse and misrepresentation of the correlation coefficient. I mean, look at this one, linking autism to organic food. There are many issues, and to mention but a few, there are issues of definition of autism, fueled by anecdotal evidence, all influenced by confirmation bias, i.e., if I hadn't believed it, I wouldn't have seen it, plus late identification so that onset is unclear. But I wonder how many young parents who saw this data changed their eating habits. I mean, there are numerous statistics traps, and for those who want to explore the many ways that we are misled by data, I suggest a couple of useful books. There's Daniel Levitin, who is Professor of Psychology, Behavioural Science and Music at McGill University, and then there is Todd Rose of Harvard's Graduate School of Education, both of which help us to recognise how the evidence that is presented is often rather shaky. And because we want to avoid such serious misrepresentations as the Andrew Wakefield scandal, where he linked the MMR vaccine to autism onset, but his evidence was riddled with holes, and yet it made it into the Lancet, peer-reviewed, which was giving it great credibility and enormous impact. There was a dramatic reduction in the uptake of the MMR vaccine and the subsequent increase in the occurrence of measles, which is a very serious disease in children. We therefore need to be open and critical of what is being claimed in the name of neuroscience. Through all the subtle tripwires in the two books I mentioned, I need to simplify, but to avoid the binary trap. So I will suggest that there are three fundamental issues that we need to keep in our minds. The first is, what are the causes of the correlations and the evidence presented? And then, could it change in some way? And finally, let's look much more carefully at the quality of our measurements. Now, I mentioned earlier the issue of the direction of causality. And in neuroscience, we need to remain open to the possibility that rather than electrical activity causing experience, it's the other way round, in a complex feedback loop. And this is especially true as we learn more about how the brain manages to find alternative routes. We've all experienced driving and finding our roadblock and hence changing our route. Whatever firing we find today in the brain will become increasingly complex as we discover the degree of route changing, called neuroplasticity, that the brain is capable of. Today's firings may not necessarily be definitive. So using this image as a proxy for neuroscience, linking these bright lights to the hum of lived experience requires great caution. No matter what detailed and direct mapping we establish between mental and neural states, there are so many options that remain on the table before we can proclaim that we've reduced mental processes to thoughts and brain processes. Simply connecting firing in brain area X to perhaps behavioural evidence of pain cannot be identical to feeling pain. And we always have the issue of which came first. The thought of firing, the well-known chicken and egg issue. It's also worth noting here that I'm talking about some fundamental biological signals and reactions. It is even more difficult to link bright lights to people's thinking about the Big Bang. That seems very far off indeed. And really, many mental phenomena have characteristics that probably defy physical description, that will never be captured by electrical firing. Which brings me back to invoking the discontinuity between water and steam metaphor, which here means the discontinuity between electrical activity and thought. Now let me turn to the third fundamental question about how good our measurements really are. As we saw with autism, there are a huge number of issues of definition, identification, onset. Similarly, there are huge issues with an area I know particularly well, our measurement of personality. Are we happy with the way we do self-report? Is it sufficient to establish things like introversion and extraversion? Are we happy that the debates that prevailed when I was an undergraduate, Alport, Eysenck, Cattell, Schutz, Michel, are these now resolved? Or are we following the trend I have suggested earlier, that we are allowing simplification to take root? Do we really know what personality is? Have we really separated who I think I am from who I really am? Or are we hoping that neuroscience will clinch the deal for us? And are we really measuring personality effectively? Are we happy that we only need 5 factors to describe it? Are we clear why the Big Five model has come to dominate? And are the multiple studies and complex statistics really asking the right questions? I have severe issues with the current state of art, or science, and I suggest that we have a gross oversimplification, driven perhaps by our underlying desire for simplification. So before neuroscience falls into the trap of trying to confirm that simplification, let me raise some of my questions that still need to be addressed. I have addressed them in more detail elsewhere, and you can email me if you'd like to know more, but a few of the headlines are as follows. One is what I call the language dilemma. We rely so heavily on self-report, which depends on how people interpret words, and here is an example. A questionnaire might ask a question like, how much do you like change? and these three people can have quite different views of what this means. I wear new clothes every day, or I get a new job every year, or we need to overthrow the government. These are so different into what they mean, covered by a rather simplistic self-report question. We've got to remember that words are fuzzy sets, and so when we combine things like this, we could be combining things that are significantly different. So let me illustrate this with items from one of the most reputable personality questionnaires, the NEO. What do these items suggest to you about the domain of personality? I mean, are they measuring preference or behaviour or emotion? I suggest that number one is really asking about preference, but number two is more about reported behaviour, and number three is something to do with attitude. Number four, motivation or preference. Number five, emotion. But they are all put together in one questionnaire because they give acceptable psychometric properties, i.e. they intercorrelate and they allow us to form scales. Now I'm afraid that to me this is blind empiricism. It's using a methodology which I don't think is actually fit for purpose. Remember that the psychometric model was developed for ability tests, and I suggest that it is not quite up to the job for the domain of what we call personality. And the Big Five is founded on this. And neuroscience is now being used to give it more credibility. Perhaps those academics who criticise the MBTI should be more critical in their own back garden and clarify what they are measuring. At least Isabel was clearer about the domain she was interested in. She did narrow it down to preference, but that in itself is still problematic. So consider a bit more carefully what we're asking people to do when we say your preference. Would you prefer to eat or breathe? Have a week of love or excitement? Have diarrhea or constipation? Be stuck in a lift with an ISTJ or an ENFP? These are not always easy choices. And then to say at home with your slippers on, this is potentially confusing. Why at home? Why not where you feel most alive or energized, which may be in the woods or at the football club? I will say more about the inappropriateness of suggesting a context later, but first let's explore preference a bit further. So think about what preference could really mean. For some, it could be their current role. People often confuse or merge role with personality. But really, perhaps we are asking about your comfort zone, which may be the idea behind the question of with your slippers on. But sometimes your preference is simply how you have come to know yourself, your history, the story you've developed about yourself. But sometimes it could be the person you've never allowed yourself to be. There is a lot of potential in people that sometimes does not get expressed. And then sometimes a preference is not really your preference, it's someone else's. Maybe your parents, for example. And of course, preference could always be that side of you that has been suppressed or neglected for too long. So in the quest for simplicity, have we trivialized the preference question? And I think we should really recognize that when we ask the question, it really does depend. And now let's look at what is possibly the greatest neglect in this area. And perhaps it is the behaviourist legacy, which makes it hard for some to recognise that not all behaviour reveals your personality. Consider the extreme context, the Milgram experiments. Did they reveal more sadists than we ever believed existed? I suggest that the issue of separating context from personality has been sadly neglected, and while it's not just me or Walter Mischel, but Professor Jerome Kagan in this book, the very first chapter is called Missing Context. And a way I've found to describe the issue to people usefully is to suggest that they think about life as a tug of war. And this end represents the context, the situation, the demands. And this end represents the inner being, my preferences. Clearly, behaviour is the consequence of the dynamic tension between the two. But have you ever found yourself doing things because it's expected of the situation or your role in that situation? Again, I have elaborated on this elsewhere, but in essence, I think we need to clarify the difference between being and doing. And the current state of play does a very poor job of that. So in answer to the question, what is personality? I'm afraid that the Big Five model is still far from satisfying. It may provide some kind of high-level structure, but it is far from the answer, in the same way as air is a high-level structure for describing what we breathe. The Big Five has become a blanket which appears to have stopped people thinking more carefully about some very important distinctions. As I said earlier, I think we need to clarify the difference between being and doing, but also we should clarify more about what we are becoming, to challenge the static model of personality and endorse Jung's philosophy more fully. Type as a compass for where we are going and not for something to describe where we've come from. So we should not just blindly join the Big Five bandwagon, and one way to break away from that is using the Four Selves model, which I use to help people explore their personality by untangling some of these issues. This is because I see self-report questionnaires as a way of helping people to sort through their ideas, to express their ideas, and potentially to change them. Now, this may not fit with the idea that some people have of a psychometric, but I think it fits more closely to the reality of what we're doing. And the Four Selves model is being more nuanced than the oversimplistic, generalized, typical you. So I introduce it like this. We all have an outer persona and an inner, more private self. And then you consider how differently you would behave if the head of the mafia walked in, or if this character walked in, or this little girl. Each one elicits a different behaviour, and I call this the contextual self. Clearly, where I am influences what I do, and we all play several roles. We have multiple contextual selves. We should not think of this as inauthentic, but we do need to recognise that behind every role there is always a sense of who I really am, and I call this the identity self. And whatever your sense of identity, all of us have some image of the person that we would like to be, the ideal self. And sadly, this is a much neglected concept in psychometrics. So we ask people to think of themselves most naturally, and we call this the way it is. And then we ask them to think about the way they would want to be. And this can be influenced, we know, by the person's personality that has never been allowed to flourish. It may be their aspirations. It may be influenced by important people in their lives. Now, before I show you how all this is presented in people's report, remember that the journey of self-awareness is never done. All of us could discover new depths, good or bad, if we were suddenly, say, in an earthquake or a war and living in a refugee camp. Do we really know how brave, altruistic or cruel we could become? So there is always room left for the undiscovered self. So when people are asked to complete the type dynamics indicator, the TDI, and note this is one of the few type indicators that has registered test status with the British and European Psychological Associations, their reports encourage a little more exploration than the more typical type process, which encourages people to nail their best fit type. It gives a comprehensive narrative, as you can see from the things on this page, but it presents preference in a way that reminds people that they are both sides, as well as presenting them with the more traditional graph. But it also invites you to listen to the nuances in your preferences as summarized here. So here we see that we have a person with the white here who is an INTJ. Those are the preferences the way it is. But when they answered the want questions, they came out as an ISFP. Now that is quite a difference. But those differences are a very rich uncovering of what this person believes. And interestingly, in fact, 72% of the population report a difference in their preferred type. This is huge. This, in fact, is being obscured when we consider the more usual and simplistic exploration of type. There's an enormous difference between seeking the certainty of true type versus recognizing the nuances of preference and how I express my type, such that I tend to react when people say I am an INTJ, because in our binary thinking world, establishing certainty is more natural than exploring ambiguity. So in consequence, the key theme in this talk has been that we are too easily influenced with simple answers. This is in psychology, in neuroscience, and in our public discourse. So my appeal is to encourage a more nuanced approach to both personality and neuroscience, to make our investigations more interesting, to go beyond the current orthodoxy, certainly in personality measurement. But also, I would like to elevate the role of experience and narrative in our explorations, and rather than seeing these as footnotes to the real science, this means accepting a more realistic view of the nature of self-report data, that it does not measure a DNA, but that what it reveals can be of equal importance. So in summary, I am asking you to join me in being healthily sceptical about the evidence that's presented and to help fight the flight towards superficiality. I'm also asking you to recognise the nuances that will lead to more challenging questions and not to be hoodwinked by the simple trappings of science. And I repeat that I do see myself as a scientist, but I would like to reiterate, I'm in favour of science, I'm in favour of evidence, but if physics has recognised that we have missed 96% of the universe and has had to postulate dark matter to provide some kind of framework to keep the enterprise together, then and psychology should recognise that it has its own blind spots and that blindly following a path that fits the physical sciences is not really what we should be doing. Physics looks at the domain of matter, but psychology should be looking at the domain of what matters, which I suggest in all our lives is what we call experience. Thank you for listening.